crazy. All right. So this is Johnny's really excited to talk to you. I only went through a couple different things about what a lobbyist is, but we did do a little mock Congress a couple weeks ago. Understanding, I think, of the process, but this is all, Capital Classroom, I think, is new for them as well.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to start out with maybe, some stuff about you, or we can talk about what we know, or we have some questions, or whatever you guys want to do?
Well, I'll be happy to start out, and then I'll ask questions, ask about you guys, and go from there. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I'm going to let someone else sit here, and I'll move.
Okay. All right, Johnny. You're pretty excited about this, aren't you? You do know that your classmates are going to be teasing you after this, so
I
you
know,
better.
Every day. Especially her.
Well, I'm glad all of you are doing this. I am Charlie Brown, and that really is my name. I look a lot like him. I've got the bald head, kind of a round face, so you all can laugh. It actually works out very well for me in this arena because people don't forget my name. So legislators, when they meet a Charlie Brown, kind of tend to remember that, which I think is a good thing because then they remember the issues that I want to talk to them about. I have been a lobbyist for about 25 years now. I went to law school prior to starting my lobbying career. And before that, I worked on Capitol Hill out in Washington, D.C. Enjoyed all those years, but really didn't want to stay out in Washington, D.C., wanted to come back home and found a way to maintain my interest in the political process through lobbying. And before that, I graduated from college at University of Oregon, go Ducks, and was living there in Oregon for a number of years. So, kind of the reason for telling you a little bit about that is that I want to encourage all of you. I do this every year. I encourage all of you to stay in school, get your degree, and find a job that you're really happy with. If that job is something you can do right out of high school, go do it. If it means that you need to go get an AA or a BA or even a graduate degree after that, then go do that. There's nothing that should hold you back in life, and pursue what you're interested in, because if you're happy with what you do, you're going to be happy in life in general. So just don't drop out of high school. And if I find out any of you do it, I'm going to go find the superintendent down there, who I happen to know because I represent Franklin Pierce School District down here in Olympia. Get out of town. How about that?
I know.
Yeah, I'm telling you. And I'm going to sick Frank Hewins on you. So, so the way that my business works, there are different types of lobbyists. There are some lobbyists that are agency lobbyists who work for various state agencies or city governments, maybe, or counties who lobby down here. Those would be public entity lobbyists. And most often they work for the agency or the city or the county that they represent. There are lobbyists who work for companies and special interest organizations, whether it's like a Puget Sound Energy, who's the energy provider, utility provider in your area, or a ACLU or an environmental defense fund. They are oftentimes employed by the people that represent them or that they represent. And then there are people like me who have my own lobbying firm, and I represent a number of different interests, including school districts, Franklin Pierce, Bethel School District, the Puget Sound, or the Pierce County Skills Center, and Tacoma School District, as well as a number of large corporations that have interests that need to be represented down here. And Fred Meyer is one of my clients. Just for instance, retailers are often seeing legislation that might not be in the best interests of them being able to continue doing what they do. So you could be a contract lobbyist, is what I'm called, and basically have your own lobbying firm and represent a number of different interests. So there's all different shapes and sizes of lobbyists in Olympia. And one thing I'll say about lobbying is that the legislators, I believe, really like having lobbyists around because the numbers of issues that they're dealing with are so vast and differentiated that they can't obviously know everything about everything. And so the lobbyist comes in and provides that information to them on all manner of issues. They're dealing with issues like Law and Justice Committee to education funding over in the Ways and Means and Education Committees to issues dealing with telecommunication services and trying to get telecommunication services out into rural communities, or even legislation that requires cities to work with the cell phone companies so we can actually put more cell phone towers throughout the state and make sure that everybody's cell phone works all over the place. So there's a multitude of issues that are out here. I don't necessarily get into higher education, but you've got a whole bunch of folks that represent the four-year colleges and the two-year colleges, and they've got issues. And I don't really get into some of the health and safety, well, I guess human services committees. That's just not an area that direct client interest in. So, but otherwise I get into environmental law, land use law, education law, utility law, energy. I mean, you name it. I at one point or another may have had my fingers in on something in that area. So I will open it up to questions from there and see if you guys have questions of me, given that part of the presentation.
Cool.
Any questions for him?
Anything?
What did he say?
About how he was talking to basically the director, the guy behind the scenes, about the funding that would be stopped because of the cities.
Ask Go up there.
Hey, well, fellow, I'm Dre. So I wanted to ask about, this kind of just came into our attention by our teacher and I guess the director, a guy that works behind the scenes with you guys. I don't remember his name exactly, but yeah, correct.
He's standing right back there. So be careful what you say. So go ahead.
So I wanted, okay, so I heard this is kind of the first time ever happening that lobbyists wouldn't be accepting some of the things that the president has gone by. The state has gone by, and that it would, since you said that you work with Franklin Pierce and all their school districts, the federal funding would be somewhat cut for not following certain rules that apply from the federal government, you know, how they fund it. And so I'm just kind of wondering where is your standpoint on that, I guess?
How's it going to affect us?
How is it going to affect us? And
I mean, we gonna graduate, so.
Are we still gonna graduate?
Stay in school no matter what you do. I'm just going to put that right back on the table, all right? Don't use Donald Trump or anybody else as an excuse, right? So I think what you're asking is a question related to the administration's executive order on immigration and whether cities that decide they want to be sanctuary cities would be eligible, continue to be eligible for funding from federal government. Is that basically kind of what you're getting at?
yes, sir.
Yeah. So the number one, you don't have to worry about it. Let's just lay that on the table. You guys, I don't think that Franklin Pierce School District is going to be impacted at all. I think that what happened in around the nation in a number of cities, including Seattle and Olympia, and major cities around the nation who decided to call themselves a sanctuary city. The president has said that he would cut off federal funding that goes to those cities for various grants or police, public safety and issues of that nature. But the rhetoric that the president is using doesn't match the authority that the president actually has to affect those outcomes. Quite frankly, the funding that comes through a lot to the cities for a lot of those programs is driven by congressional legislative action, by law. And the president, as much as he might want to think that he is the CEO of the United States of America, he is one of 3 branches of government that decide how policy and how the United States is going to move forward. That's the beauty of the Constitution. The Constitution has the separation of powers doctrine, right? So it was really set up to prevent the kind of takeover of any part of the government by any one person, that by having checks and balances. The judiciary, they're going to use legal means to say, you can't do this, Mr. President, if the president tries to do something that is counter to what the underlying law is. If the president really wants to cut that funding, he has to go to Congress, and Congress has to approve of it. And I can tell you that it's going to be very difficult for this president to try and get the majority of the House of Representatives, and I believe there's 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, that he'd have to get 217 votes. There are people in pretty deeply red states that are not in agreement with the president on this immigration order, and certainly not on his desire to impose a 20% tax, as he said, on Mexico for to build the wall. Right? He wants to build this wall in Mexico. You're going to pay for it, and they said, no, we're not going to pay for it. The president says, well, I'm going to slap a tax on you. Well, nice try, Mr. President. The state of Texas would go into a recession if they slapped a 20% tax on goods going from Mexico, because Mexico is going to turn around and slap that same tax on all the stuff into Texas. And who's Texas's #1 trading partner? Mexico, right? And what is one of the largest states in the union? Texas. What's one of the largest states with Republican senators, not senators, but representatives? Texas. Tell me how you get those Texas representatives to say, I'm going to put my state in a recession because the president wants me to. Thank you, Mr. President. We're not going to agree on that issue. Let's go on to another issue, right? You want to talk about oil, you want to talk about pipelines, you want to talk about economic development. We're with you there. You want to talk about putting my state into a recession and harming every one of the businesses in my state? Mr. President, that's what the separation of powers is all about, and you aren't going to get my vote, right? So your question, Greg, is a really good question, and something that I want all of you to really pay attention to when Andy talks to you about the structure of the Constitution and the meaning of the Constitution and why the amendments to the Constitution are there. It's designed to make sure that we as a nation can never get overtaken, excuse me, overtaken by any one entity out there, as that Constitution is structured right now. There is some concern out there that there's enough Republicans in the House and Senate and around the nation, because under the Constitution, in order to, you know, the states have a lot of power under the Constitution as well. You wouldn't really think about it this way, but in order to do a constitutional convention and change the Constitution, you've got to get it ratified by all the states. That's another check on the power of the federal government to impact our lives on a day-to-day basis out here in Washington or in Utah or California or Delaware, right? And there are enough. There's a bunch of states that are controlled by Republican legislatures and the governor's office, where a constitutional convention could be called. There's still 2 states short on that, but I really doubt that a constitutional convention would be called, because I don't think that the American people overall are interested in changing the separation of powers doctrine, which has so successfully kept our nation moving forward for over 200 years. So it's a long way of answering your question, but Greg, there's a lot of checks and balances where the money that the president might have bombastically stated he was going to cut can't happen. Bottom line, thank you, Mr. Trump. What's next? Okay, what's next?
Hello, I'm John.
Hi, John.
How do you deal with like conflicts of like interest? Like, for example, like your personal political beliefs. Like if you believe something, but then you have to contradict yourself. Like, how do you deal with that?
It's pretty simple for me. I have chosen to represent the interests that I personally agree with. And I have been fortunate enough that I don't have to represent interests I don't agree with. And I'm not going to say that what one person believes is absolutely wrong. What one person believes is really up to them, and you know, what their circumstance might be at the time, how they were raised, what kind of environment they were raised in. But for me, I am very comfortable in saying no to certain interests, because I just don't believe in what they are trying to promote. I've got an example where about 10 years ago or so, a tobacco client, you know, asked if I might be interested in representing them, and the pay was good. There's no question about it. The pay was good. But I went home and I thought about it, and at the end of the day, what I said was, how could I tell my mother and father, or my mother-in-law and father-in-law, that I have this client? And I would have been essentially, for me, not proud of saying it. I probably would have tried to hide it from him, which indicates there's probably a little guilt, which indicates perhaps a little shame. And I decided not to take it. And, you know, I'm all the happier, and I'm still here, and I'm still able to put some food on my table. So if you agree with the issues that your client espouses, it's a really easy job to do. If you don't, you really shouldn't be doing it, and you should carry that kind of an attitude, I believe, in all aspects of your life. But that's the Charlie Brown in me.
It's catchy.
Well,
Yeah.
All right.
Hi there.
What kind of education do you need to be a lobbyist?
Good question. You have to graduate from high school. Okay. Is anybody unclear about my stance on making sure you guys graduate? I just want to make sure.
I got it.
Okay, good.
I know. I got it.
You don't necessarily have to have a particular education to be a lobbyist. About a third of us do hold law degrees of some sort. I'm still licensed to practice law, so I could go and, you know, do stuff in the court if I wanted to, but I really don't. That's not what interests me. Most of the people who are down here come from all walks of life. Some people come right out of high school or college, most often college. I think it's much more beneficial if you've got some higher ed education of some sort. And some of them come just directly here and start working as lobbyists. They have found a.
They pause for a minute. Looks like I think their connection failed.
Okay.
So they stepped off. Hopefully they'll just rejoin.
Right.
Just keep on going. That was a great answer to his question.
Oh, thank you.
Looks like they're back.
Oh, there you are.
Charlie.
I was worried.
There he is, Johnny. Johnny. Okay, are you back?
I think they're having internet problems.
There you got really slow internet.
Okay.
Okay, are we back?
Sorry, my computer was low on battery.
So I was saying that in terms of what it requires to be a lobbyist in education, there is no lobbying school. There's no pathway, traditional pathway of becoming a lobbyist. Some people become lobbyists right out of high school or college because they're interested in the public policy arena. Others come into it because they're thrust into it due to maybe some legislation that might impact them one way or the other. A number of folks come to it because they started working in the legislature as a staff person and decided to leave and do something else. There are some people who are just people who care about the environment and have come and want to work on carbon reduction legislation. There are some parents, the Parent-Teacher Association has a lot of mothers and fathers who come down and lobby on education issues. You could get into it that way. You can get into it in just about any, through any pathway. And I think that's probably the most fascinating part of this job is that you're meeting from people from all walks of life who have totally different interests. It's kind of like a classroom. I mean, you all come from different places. You come together and, you know, it's amazing how being together on a day-to-day basis and going through a similar experience can build friendships. And that's a lot of what the lobbying corps, I call it, and that would be CORP, meaning the group lobbying corps. We're all, for the most part, good friends. We fight each other on a regular basis on our issues, but at the end of the day, we go and hang out together and have fun and laugh about, you know, what we're doing. So no particular pathway into it. And the problem is that once you get politics in your blood, it seems like there's no pathway out of it too. So, so good question. Young lady, you had a question?
I did. Okay. My name is Whitney. You said you were a contract lobbyist, so you cover a wide topic or different topics. My question for you is, what area of interest takes up the majority of your attention?
That's a really good question. It changes from year to year, Whitney. But this year it's education and education funding. Let's just be honest about it. The McCleary decision, which is a state Supreme Court decision that found that the legislature had failed in its paramount duty, which is the provision of public education, which is K through 12 in this state. They were failing to adequately fund education. That decision came down in about 2012, and the Supreme Court said that you have until 2018 essentially to fix it, and that was all based on some legislation that had passed previously. This year they haven't been able to get all the way there yet. They've put some more money into funding school districts to cover the cost of your lights, your heating, your books, your desks. They call that materials, supplies, and operating costs. They put more money into student transportation so that school districts could actually cover the actual cost of the school buses that get you from here to there every day, which they weren't previously doing, and some other areas. But what they have not been able to do yet is to figure out how the state can fully cover the costs of staff compensation. And that is essentially your teachers, your janitors, the secretaries, the school superintendent, the folks that do all the accounting for the school district, all your staff that it takes to provide what I call the business of education. They need to figure out how to adequately cover the costs of the staff to do that. And the school districts have had to rely on local property taxes and a request every 4 years for the school levies, they call them. And the court said you can't do that anymore. And so the legislature is trying to figure out how to come up with about a $1.5 to $2 billion additional amount of money to cover the cost of education and staff compensation. So if any of you happen to have a couple of billion hanging out,
Yeah.
I'm sure we'd be happy to, yeah, right there. The most fascinating part of that question, though, Whitney, is, what takes up the most of your time? And it in this case is taking up most time of the legislature, but that is only one aspect of everything else that's going on around here. There was a Supreme Court decision recently on water and water rights, and whether you could pull water out of rivers and out of the ground in order to provide drinking water for cities and towns. And that Supreme Court decision said, you're not looking at the quote unquote hydraulic continuity of the whole area, so you can't pull that water out. Well, whole counties now have stopped issuing water rights. We may end up in a situation where we can't get any additional water, so that's going to stop any residential construction, which means that people who have homes might be in okay shape, but families who are moving here or growing families who are moving out of mom and dad's house might not have a place to go. So they've got to deal with a big water related issue that gets pretty technical. They're also dealing with something called Real ID, which is where you have your driver license identification that is required under federal law now to state whether you have your birth certificate or your passport as proof that you can fly around the U.S. And you don't have to have that particular driver license to be able to fly around. But if you don't have a driver's license that says you've proven your citizenship here in the U.S. Or have the visa to go with it, then you're going to have to carry those separate documents. All that stuff came out in the wake of 9/11, and our state has yet to finally fix that. But theoretically, in 2018, January 1 of next year, if the state doesn't have this Real ID and you don't have your documents with you, you might end up not being able to have as the freedom to travel that we have right now. But it's all security related in the United States. I got to say, life was a lot easier before 2001, before 9/11. But that's the world we live in now. So that's what's taken up most of my time, Whitney. But if you want to talk about carbon taxes, I can talk to you about that. I'm dealing with that. Or mercury light recycling, I'm dealing with that. Or recycling electronics, I can talk to you about that. What fun. So I mean, the blessing of what I do, it's kind of like you guys, you got math, science, some PE probably, you got civics, which is the most important class in all of your courses, right, Andy? And you've got, a couple of other courses. I get to deal with a whole lot of things all at one time, so I'm never really just bored with one single issue dominating everything I do. So it's kind of fun. You got a question?
Yeah.
You're pointing at somebody. Greg was back there pointing at somebody.
So one of my questions is how we were talking about having disagreements with the federal government on the state level. What is the legality and repercussions of that? Like, I know we have state rights, but at the same time, disagreeing with the federal government must come with some kind of punishment, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, let's take the 21-year-old drinking age, for instance, and I think this happened back in the 1970s, give or take. The federal government said prior to this law going into effect, I think it was like 1973 or something. Don't ask me why I know, but I do. Every state was allowed to set its own drinking age, and Wyoming, where I was born and raised, it was an 18-year-old drinking age. Same for Idaho, Utah. A lot of the western states had lower drinking ages. Some states had 21-year-old drinking ages, and the federal government figured out a clever way of using the National Highway Transportation Funding law to say that if you don't raise your drinking age to age 21, we're not going to send you highway transportation dollars. Well, think about states like ours or Wyoming that are just massive, right? 400 miles this way and 400 miles that way, and all points in between. They couldn't fund their own highway system, so they have to take the federal money. So they had to change their drinking ages to 21 so they could keep getting that money. That's the kind of penalty that they could hold over on a couple of things. In terms of what is going on today, for back to the immigration question, there are no penalties that I know of that that the administration could impose on a state because they refuse to comply with what's essentially just an executive order. The distinction of what's going on right now is that, and all presidents have done this, but this president is using the executive order power to try and set policy without going to Congress and asking for them to bless that proposal and amend it and think through it and debate it and go through all the steps that are necessary to pass a law. And so this executive order is basically a statement of how this president wants to deal with things. Now, he does have the authority because Congress granted it to him, to the office of the presidency, not to this president, but to the office of the presidency years ago in terms of security at our borders. And that's what that executive order is getting at. And what the president said during the campaign and what he's carrying out now are essentially the same. He told the American people that he was going to get strong on immigration. He was going to do extreme vetting. He was going to close our borders to illegal immigrants or people trying to get in. He carries it out through the powers that Congress had granted him, or granted to the presidency, the office of the presidency, years ago. And to that degree, what you're seeing now should tell each and every one of you that you need to vote. You need to take the statements of candidates seriously. You need to talk to your friends, find out what they think of the comments that are going on, discuss it among yourselves, and cast your vote in the way that you feel is most important to you. And elections have consequences. And if people sat home and thought that there's no way that this country could elect Donald Trump and decided not to vote, they essentially cast their vote for Donald Trump because they didn't vote. If people felt like Hillary Clinton you couldn't trust her and this was the only alternative you had, you're right. There's a lot of people who didn't trust Hillary Clinton and didn't believe that she was the candidate for them on the Democratic side. So maybe they voted for Trump because they so disliked her. That tells you that you need to get involved in deciding who your candidates are going to be and get serious about voting in primaries too. So, yeah, he's got the power to do what he's doing. It's only an executive order. It is somewhat limited in scope. But it also tells you that ignore public policy and elections at your own peril.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned that you work with Fred Meyers and all that. I wonder what other kind of benefits you get besides for like money, because you probably get money from them, but other benefits that you might get for working with them.
You get discounts?
I don't get any personal benefit other than compensation for the work that I do for any of my clients.
I like that.
It's just not how it works. I'd be hard pressed to find anybody around here that is getting something other than remuneration for representing their clients. It's for the most part prohibited in the first place by law. But second place, I mean, I might have a Fred Meyer a card, that I go in and every time I buy something, they know what I'm buying, and maybe I get the discount price, kind of like a Safeway card, right? It's the same thing, but I don't get anything special for anything that I do on behalf of my clients. And there's an important piece here you raise. Lobbyists are prohibited from representing clients on a contingent fee basis, and a contingent is basically meaning that if you win, we will pay you X. And the reason why there's no in some arenas you can do contingency fee, but here the idea behind the prohibition of contingency fees is that a contingency fee might entice a lobbyist to do something nefarious in order to get their bill through. And it's not in the public policy interest, so the legislature's decided, actually the people through initiative decided this, to allow contingency fees. So, there is nobody down here that gets $1 million bonus for passing a piece of legislation. That would create an undue influence on decision-making for people, because let's say you did that and you just kind of happened to whisper to a legislator, hey, you know what, if this bill goes through, maybe I can, throw you a little bone on the side. That's not okay. And it's prohibited by law. And there's the whole Public Disclosure Commission that makes sure that that never will happen. And they actually look into finances of folks. So it's only I get a flat fee for doing what I do. And I'll tell you what, it works for me. I'm happy. I like what I do. So there you go.
All right, so I got a question. So as a lobbyist, so do you make it flat pay, as in like there's a certain amount that you will be paid, or is it depending on what clients you have? So like you were talking about how you had the whole thing with Marble. So does it depend on like how much you get paid by the certain client, or is it just a flat pay that you make hourly?
No, it's a flat pay per client. I call it a retainer fee. That's kind of the way that it's referred to. So they pay a certain amount of money to me on an annual basis, and it's a retainer. They retain my services, right? So that's where retainer fee comes from. And it depends on the client. Some clients may have more resources than others, and I'll take that into consideration when I'm bidding out the work. Some clients may have an issue that is going to be a really challenging issue. I'll take that into consideration because the amount of time that it's going to take me to try and push a more controversial issue, the more I'll have to charge for it. There's an instance where there's a company here in the state of Washington now that makes rockets, right? So you know that Blue Origin and SpaceX and some of these other ones are building rockets because NASA is kind of getting out of the business, right? And Boeing makes rockets, other people make rockets. Everybody makes rockets. Let's get a rocket. This company wants to have a tax break to keep their business here. That's going to be a big lift, right? Because you're trying to push a tax break in the face of the need for education funding on the other side. And if you take taxes from, you give an exemption here, you got to make them up somewhere else, right? So that would be a client where it would seem to me that you'd want to have a really, really high retainer for, just because the time that it would take and what you're trying to do to push something like that would be a challenge. Other people, I've got one client that's the asparagus growers in the state. I eat your asparagus when it comes on the market, where all I do is really just kind of report to them. I keep track of all the bills that might impact them, and I just report to them what's going on. If one of those bills has an issue, then we'll agree that I'll work on it at a different rate. But for right now, all I do is report, and that's a very small contract, only a couple $1,000. So.
We have about 1 minute left.
Okay.
Before, class ends at 45, but I want them to do a little reflection after this. So if we have maybe one more question.
Can we see David?
Wait. Can I ask a couple questions?
Somebody who has not asked a question.
Go, John.
I'm Bob.
Just have Kristen.
What?
No other questions? Nobody? Okay, John, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, can we see David? That's one.
Yeah, I guess you can. He's taking off his equipment here.
All right, I have a program. That's one. And then two. Hi, David. And then, okay, and then two. Who are you going for the Super Bowl?
Well, you gotta go for the Falcons. Come on,
Thank you.
right?
Thank you.
I mean, Tom Brady's a cheater. You know, the guy deflates balls. He thinks he's hotter than he is. He's not.
I like you the man, Charlie Brown. You the man, Charlie Brown.
On a personal question, Mr. Brown, what kind of car do you drive? I gotta know. I gotta know. I gotta know.
What if I told you I had a Chevy Chevelle, baby, with 4 on the floor and a V8 350 with a 4-head cam? How about that? You go, baby, go.
We like you.
I drive a Lexus.
Okay.
So on a yearly, like, what do you make a year, if you don't mind me asking? Not like an exact like amount around the
Estimate.
estimate wise.
Like gross income amount.
You know, like do
Or
you ball out?
taxes.
You be balling out or like?
I can share mine if you want. It's probably not even close, but.
It's all public information, but what I will say is how much one person makes versus other persons make doesn't really matter, right?
Yes.
Do what you do, love what you do, and the question of compensation shouldn't play into it. Don't get yourselves all wrapped around material things in life. Make sure that you keep your feet on your ground. You know who loves you. You love them back. And just be good citizens. And the rest is going to come. And I make more than $100,000 a year. We'll leave it at that.
John, will you save it for next time?
Is that a green screen?
Next time. Is it a green screen? I don't think so. I don't think it's a green screen.
Is that a picture or a poster?
That's a
everybody
picture.
else say thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, thank you. Everybody, thank you very much.
For next time.
Okay, make sure you have questions for me.
Yeah, we'll get some more. Thank you very much.
So Cambo,